Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the darkest chapters in history, a time when humanity was caught off guard by a mysterious force of nature. Picture it, the 14th century, and a terrifying new disease begins to spread. No modern medicine, no antibiotics, just people trying to survive with little more than faith and confusion to guide them. You, my friend, are about to step into their shoes, and trust me, you probably wouldn't last a day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment letting me know what city you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm curious. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1347. You're in Europe, and while you may have expected the usual hardships of life, poor hygiene, short life expectancy, maybe a little too much bread with some questionable meat, the world has just taken a turn for the worse. The Black Death has arrived. You don't know it yet, but everything is about to change. This is a disease that, in just a few years, will wipe out a third of Europe's population. But tonight, we're going to follow the story of how people like you tried to survive it, armed with nothing but a few superstitions, some very questionable remedies, and a whole lot of prayer. The first thing you'd notice is the fear. People are terrified. No one knows exactly what's causing this, but the symptoms are brutal. Fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, and then death. It moves fast. Like, blink and you miss it fast. The worst part? You have no idea where it came from, or who will be the next victim. Now, imagine you're a doctor in this time. You've had some basic training, but your medical knowledge is, well, let's just say primitive is putting it nicely. There's no such thing as germ theory, no antibiotics, no understanding of viruses or bacteria. You're left to try and make sense of this thing with the tools at hand. It's like trying to fix a broken car with a hammer and some twine. It's not going to work, but at least you tried. Historians still argue about the exact cause of the Black Death. Some say it was bubonic plague, others think it was a combination of plague and other diseases. No one knows for sure, but you're living it. The good news? You have some choices, none of them good, mind you, but choices nonetheless. You can try bloodletting, but that's not going to help you. Or if you're lucky enough to have a doctor who knows about herbs, maybe you'll get a few treatments that do absolutely nothing except make you smell worse. Trust me, it doesn't matter what they say. Nothing will stop the plague once it's in your town. But let's back up for a second. How did the disease even get here in the first place? This is where it gets interesting and even more terrifying. There were a lot of theories at the time, and none of them were remotely scientific. Some believed it was God's punishment. Others thought it was an astrological alignment, as if the planets just decided to have a bad day and wreak havoc on Earth. And let's not forget the most creative one, bad air. Yes, miasma theory, which held that the disease spread through rotten, bad air. Imagine your doctor saying, "It's the air, don't breathe too deeply," as a solution. It's like telling you not to get sick by just holding your breath. As the Black Death spread, cities began to panic. The rich and the powerful tried to escape, but the disease didn't care about your social status. It struck indiscriminately, leaving piles of bodies everywhere. Even the church couldn't offer any solid answers, though they were more than happy to remind you that it was all part of God's plan. Now, you might be wondering, what were people doing to stop it? Well, here's the thing. There were some serious solutions on offer. One of the most popular was a good old-fashioned quarantine. In fact, the word quarantine comes from the Italian word for 40, quaranta, as ships arriving from infected ports would be isolated for 40 days to make sure the crew wasn't carrying the disease. It was a start, but honestly, if you were living in a cramped house or a crowded city, you might have better luck throwing salt over your shoulder and hoping for the best. In the absence of any real answers, people got creative with their remedies. They used all sorts of bizarre treatments, from placing a live chicken near the infected areas to suck out the disease, to wearing protective clothing that looked more like a medieval beekeeper's outfit. Of course, nothing worked, but people had to try something, right? The scariest part? There was no way of knowing who would survive and who would fall victim. You could be walking along, feeling fine, and then boom, you're struck by the plague. Or you could be perfectly healthy for days and then suddenly your body starts to swell, the fever hits, and you're gone within hours. It was the ultimate lottery of death, and the odds were not in your favor. Historians still debate how long the Black Death lasted and what its full impact really was. But one thing's for sure, this was an event that left a permanent mark on the world. Entire communities were wiped out, and it took centuries for Europe to fully recover. Yet, it's also fascinating to see how people, despite the lack of medical knowledge, somehow pulled through. But here's the kicker. Despite all the chaos, humanity eventually started to bounce back. You might have thought the world was over, but it wasn't. Societies rebuilt, economies recovered, and life, in its way, went on. Now that you've gotten a taste of what it was like during the initial outbreak of the Black Death, let's talk about the brutal reality of living in a world with no antibiotics. At this point, you've probably realized that survival is a mix of luck, superstition, and the occasional bad decision. But hey, at least you're still here, right? Without modern medicine, your options for treatment are, let's be honest, terrible. We're talking about a time when the best doctors could offer was a mix of herbs, prayers, and, well, guesswork. Picture this. You're living through a pandemic, but instead of being able to pop a pill or get a shot, you're stuck hoping some medieval concoction will work. In the absence of antibiotics, people tried everything. For instance, some believed that the plague could be cured by rubbing a frog on the infected area. Others thought a mix of vinegar and mercury could somehow purge the disease. Now, if you're thinking that sounds more like medieval witchcraft than medicine, you're absolutely right. In fact, many doctors didn't understand germs, viruses, or bacteria at all. Instead, they relied on trial and error, hoping something would. Unfortunately, most of the time it didn't act. The most common treatment people received during the Black Death was bloodletting. Yes, that's right. Bloodletting. The practice where doctors would drain your blood in the hopes that it would rid your body of toxins. Modern science has since confirmed that, no, draining your blood doesn't cure anything. But back then, it was as common as taking an aspirin for a headache. So, imagine you're already on your last legs, feeling feverish, swollen, and weak, and the doctor decides, let's just take some of your blood out. Not the best plan, I'd say. Another popular remedy involved burning aromatic herbs, like rosemary or lavender, in the belief that the good air would fight off the bad air. Maybe they thought the disease would be repelled by a particularly strong smell of flowers. Who knows? It's like spraying perfume on a garbage heap and hoping the smell magically vanishes. But of course, this did nothing to stop the plague either. The truly horrifying part was that even those who managed to get treatments didn't have much hope. The plague was often fatal, especially when it hit the larger cities where crowded conditions made it easier for it to spread. You could be in the same room as someone who had it, and just like that, you'd catch it too. The idea of quarantining the sick didn't even really exist in a practical sense. The best you could do was isolate yourself in a room, hoping your family wouldn't catch it. And of course, if you did fall ill, the treatments you'd be given would do little to save you. If you were lucky, you might survive. If not, well, there wasn't much you could do but hope for a miracle. Meanwhile, society's reaction to the plague was as varied as the treatments. Some people were terrified, understandably so. They locked themselves indoors, refused to come into contact with anyone, and prayed for divine intervention. Others took a more, let's say, creative approach. Groups of people began to form self-punishing religious movements, hoping that by suffering, they could appease God. These flagellants would whip themselves in public as a display of their devotion. It was as if they thought that by making themselves suffer, they might ward off the plague. Talk about a twisted form of faith. And then, of course, there were the people who had absolutely no clue what was going on and were just trying to survive by any means necessary. Some resorted to superstition, carrying around charms or talismans that they believed would protect them. Others just tried to flee the cities, believing that by moving to the countryside, they could escape the disease. Unfortunately, The plague didn't care about where you lived. It followed you wherever you went. The countryside wasn't exactly a safe haven. It was just less populated, so maybe you'd have a better chance of surviving. But it wasn't all hopeless. Despite the lack of medical knowledge, communities did begin to learn what worked and what didn't. And over time, they started figuring out the importance of isolation, quarantine, and the idea that preventing the spread of the disease was the best way to handle it. This wasn't a cure, but it was a step toward understanding how diseases spread, something that would eventually save millions in the future. It's funny, isn't it? How people, with all their ignorance and fear, still manage to find ways to survive and adapt. But that's the thing about humanity. We tend to stumble through disasters, learning from our mistakes along the way. All right, let's get into something a little more chilling. Because if you think things were bad for the general public, you should take a moment to consider the lives of medieval doctors. Now, I know what you're thinking. Doctors were heroes, right? They saved lives. Well, not exactly. Back then, the idea of being a doctor was, shall we say, a bit more theatrical. Imagine you're a doctor in the midst of the Black Death. You've got a funny-looking robe that probably feels more like an oversized bird costume than a medical uniform. It's a full-body getup, with gloves, boots, and a long beak-like mask stuffed with herbs. Yes, it's as ridiculous as it sounds. The reason for this bizarre outfit? Doctors believed that bad air was the culprit behind the plague, so the mask was supposed to filter out the toxic fumes. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But don't think that doctors in the 14th century were all wearing these costumes. Most of them didn't have access to such protection. Instead, they were left to wander around the infected areas, trying their best to figure out how to treat a disease they had no real understanding of. Some would burn incense to purify the air, while others resorted to leeching, bloodletting, and even giving patients strange potions made from arsenic. Honestly, if you were a patient back then, you probably wished you had stayed in bed and prayed for divine intervention. It's easy to see how medieval doctors were hopelessly out of their depth. They were limited by the lack of understanding about bacteria, viruses, and germs. Their medicine was more based on guesswork and trial and error than anything that could actually save a life. But it wasn't all for lack of trying. They just didn't know any better. In fact, the most famous doctors of the time, like Guy de Chauliac, still wrote about treating the plague without realizing they were doing more harm than good. Their writings are almost sad to read, like they were so close to discovering the truth, but the science just wasn't there yet. Now, you might think that medical science was progressing at a slow pace, but there were actually a few advances happening, just not fast enough to deal with something like the Black Death. For example, the concept of quarantine began to take shape during this period. Cities started isolating the sick in an attempt to prevent the spread of the plague. But here's the twist. The doctors still didn't know how the disease was transmitted. They thought that avoiding bad air would save you, but they had no idea it was actually spread by fleas on rats. So, even though some measures helped in slowing the spread, they were still fighting the battle with blindfolds on. And let's talk about the advice doctors were giving to their patients. Some of the most helpful advice included things like avoiding cold drinks, because of course, drinking something too cold might shock your system and let the plague in, or avoiding bathing, because apparently bathing made you vulnerable to the disease. It's hard not to laugh at some of these remedies, but the reality is that they had no real answers. They were essentially tossing darts at a dartboard, hoping for the best. Now, let's step outside the realm of medical practice for a second and consider the psychological toll the Black Death took on people. Imagine the constant fear, the dread of walking down the street and wondering if your neighbor would be the next to die. Cities were filled with the sick and dying, and many of those who weren't infected were too terrified to leave their homes. It wasn't just the disease that was killing people, it was the psychological strain of living in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. People became obsessed with death. In fact, some cities became so overwhelmed by the number of bodies piling up that mass graves were dug, and people were buried without any proper ceremony. And the psychological effects weren't just limited to the sick and their families. Those who survived the plague often had to cope with the guilt of being alive when so many others had perished. Some felt an overwhelming sense of grief, while others saw it as a punishment from God. It was a strange mixture of relief and horror feeling that's hard to describe unless you lived through it. But what about the people who did survive? Well, their lives were forever changed by the Black Death. For one, survival rates weren't exactly high, so those who made it through often found themselves dealing with the aftermath of massive loss. Whole families were wiped out, communities were devastated. But oddly enough, the survivors had a kind of morbid advantage. With fewer people around, those who remained were in high demand. It's a strange twist of fate, really. Survival became a new kind of wealth. However, don't be fooled into thinking that surviving the Black Death meant a return to normalcy. No, the world had been irrevocably altered. Social structures had collapsed. The workforce was severely reduced, which led to economic upheaval. You were left with a world that was much less populated, much more fragile, and still deeply scarred from the pandemic. The plague didn't just take lives, it reshaped the entire world. The truth is, historians are still debating how the Black Death really impacted Europe. Some argue it was the catalyst for the Renaissance, as fewer people meant more resources for those who remain. Others point out the long-term psychological effects that lingered long after the plague had subsided. But one thing is certain: life, as people knew it, would never be the same again. Now, let's dive into the eerie world of how the Black Death spread. Imagine an eye-tone moment, life seems normal, and then within days, your world is plunged into chaos. You're just walking down the street when suddenly there's a cough. You don't think much of it, but before you know it, your neighbor is dead and the whole town is in a panic. And this is where things get even more unsettling. The speed at which the Black Death spread was unlike anything anyone had seen before. We tend to think of pandemics as something that slowly creeps across the globe, but the Black Death moved like wildfire. You might have assumed the disease would spread from one village to the next, but no, this thing didn't play by the rules. It was carried by fleas that hitched rides on rats, and that rat would happily board a ship, setting sail from port to port, spreading the plague along the way. So, you can imagine it. The plague wasn't just spreading across towns, it was crossing entire countries in a matter of days. This was pre-modern globalization at its worst. Here's the truly bizarre part though. At the time, no one knew how the disease spread. They didn't know about fleas, rats, or bacteria. Instead, people thought the plague was brought on by bad air, hence the masks and aromatic herbs they used in a desperate attempt to ward off the disease. To make matters worse, the disease's symptoms didn't always present the same way in every victim. It could show up as a fever, swollen lymph nodes, and dark purple or black spots, or it could show up as an overwhelming sense of weakness, almost like a bad flu that knocked you out cold. Now, think about the cities at the time. Imagine being in a crowded place like Florence, where you're already living in close quarters with others. The roads are narrow, people are packed together in markets, and there's not a lot of ventilation in most homes. It didn't take much for the disease to find its next victim. If you lived near a trade route, you were particularly at risk. Merchants and travelers were unknowingly spreading the disease as they moved from one place to the next. Every time a ship docked or a caravan arrived, the plague was right behind it. And if you lived on the outskirts of town, it wasn't much better. People in rural areas thought they might escape the plague simply because they were isolated, but that wasn't true either. The plague didn't care about geography. Once it reached a town, it would start spreading like wildfire. You could move to the countryside, but the disease would follow. It didn't matter if you were a peasant or a nobility, was the great equalizer. Then, there's the sheer number of people who died. By the time the plague had run its course, it's estimated that as many as 25 million people in Europe had succumbed to the disease. That's 1/3 of the entire population. Imagine that 1 in 3 people gone. Whole families wiped out in the blink of an eye. Neighborhoods emptied. Cities fell silent. Despite all this devastation, though, the disease didn't necessarily target the weakest or the sickest first. In fact, it was pretty indiscriminate. The healthy could drop dead just as quickly as the elderly. In fact, many survivors would look back at the outbreak and wonder why they made it while others didn't. But it wasn't just luck. The real reason some people survived had a lot to do with genetics and sheer chance. Historians still argue over why some individuals lived while others didn't. Some say it was because they were exposed to the disease in small doses and built up a kind of immunity over time. Others believe that genetic factors played a role. A fascinating theory has emerged in recent years, suggesting that certain genetic mutations could have given some people a better chance of surviving the plague. If you were one of the lucky ones, your genetic makeup may have allowed you to dodge death's grasp. But let's not sugarcoat it. For the vast majority, survival wasn't guaranteed. The streets of Europe were littered with the bodies of those who didn't make it. Those who were lucky enough to escape the disease faced their own set of challenges. Cities were overwhelmed with the dead. Burials were rushed. Whole families had to bury their loved ones without proper ceremonies. Can you imagine the horror of that? Going through the motions of death without a chance to mourn, with the constant weight of the plague hanging over you. Meanwhile, the church was doing its best to make sense of all this, but even the clergy weren't immune to the plague's grasp. Some priests tried to reassure the masses that this was God's punishment for their sins, but it's hard to keep that message going when the very people spreading it were dying right alongside their flock. There was also a wave of religious fanaticism. Flagellants roamed the streets, whipping themselves in the hope that their suffering would end the plague. It was as if society had lost its grip on reality, trying anything and everything to explain what was happening. And of course, there were the survivors, the people who lived through it all. If you survived the Black Death, you were left with the bitter knowledge that your life had been spared, but at what cost? Cities were ruined, entire families were gone. The world you once knew was shattered. You were left with a society that was weaker, smaller, and more fractured than before. It was a long road to recovery, and the scars of the Black Death would remain long after the disease had faded. Historians debate what the Black Death did to Europe in the long run. Some argue that it hastened the end of feudalism, as the sudden labor shortage meant that workers had more bargaining power. Others say it led to the Renaissance, as Europe began to rebuild and reimagine society in the wake of the devastation. Still, others argue that the psychological trauma of the plague left its mark on European culture, influencing everything from art to religion. One thing is certain, though: the Black Death was a turning point in human history. It reshaped Europe in ways no one could have predicted. And though it's hard to imagine living through such a time, you're one of the lucky ones who can look back and reflect on how people managed to survive and, in some cases, thrive. It was a devastating chapter in our past, but also one that demonstrates the resilience of humanity. The Black Death was a storm of death and disease, but what followed was a social earthquake that shook the very foundations of medieval Europe. It wasn't just that people died, it was how everything changed afterward. When the dust settled and the bodies were buried, Europe was left to pick up the pieces of a society that had been irrevocably altered. So, let's talk about the aftermath. You've just survived the plague, because somehow you're still here, and now you're living in a very different world. You're walking through empty streets, noticing that the shops that used to be full of life and chatter are now quiet. The market is practically deserted. The whole town feels, well, eerily vacant. But it's not just that the population has shrunk. The social structure is crumbling too. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it decimated entire classes of people, leaving a huge void. The labor force? Gone. Half of Europe's population wiped out in a matter of months. So now there's a shortage of workers. The rich and the powerful, who had once relied on the lower classes for everything from farming to craftsmanship, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. The laborers who survived were in a position of unprecedented power. You, as a survivor, might suddenly find that you have more freedom than you ever thought possible. If you were a peasant before the plague, you now have bargaining power. The landowners who once treated you as little more than a cog in the machine now have to treat you like a valuable asset. After all, they need you to till the fields, harvest the crops, and keep the economy running. You, the lowly peasant, can now demand a higher wage or even better working conditions. This shift in power wasn't just a minor adjustment, it was a revolution, a seismic shift that changed the dynamics between the classes. Of course, this newfound freedom wasn't exactly welcomed by everyone. The wealthy landowners, who were now scrambling to keep their estates running, didn't appreciate having to negotiate with the peasants. They tried to pass laws that limited wages and made it harder for workers to demand more for their labor. But here's the kicker: it didn't really work. With fewer people to do the work, the peasants had the upper hand. The nobility wasn't the only group struggling after the plague. The church, too, found itself in crisis. For centuries, the church had been the pillar of society, offering solace, explanations, and guidance. But when the Black Death struck, the church had little to offer in terms of solutions. The clergy themselves were dying in droves, and many people began to question the church's power and authority. How could the church, which had claimed to speak for God, allow such suffering and death? This wasn't just a theological crisis, it was a crisis of faith. In fact, many people began to see the Black Death as a sign that the end times were near, further eroding the church's grip on the population. People started looking elsewhere for answers, and in some cases, they turned to less orthodox forms of spirituality. The flagellant movement, where groups of people would whip themselves in a public display of piety, spread like wildfire. These extreme forms of religious fervor were an attempt to appease God, but they were also a way of coping with the hopelessness that the plague brought with it. But the flagellants were not the answer. The church, despite its own struggles, managed to reassert its influence over time, but the cracks were showing. The centuries-old monopoly on spiritual guidance was beginning to crumble. And then, there was the economy. With a drastically reduced population, entire towns and villages had been abandoned. Trade slowed to a crawl. The economy, which had been heavily reliant on the labor of peasants and workers, was now in a state of freefall. There were fewer hands to do the work, which meant that wages went up for those who remained. But the flip side was that production slowed. Crops weren't being harvested, goods weren't being produced, and the economy couldn't recover as quickly as people had hoped. But there was an upside to all of this devastation. The Black Death did, in some strange way, pave the way for new ideas and new ways of thinking. With fewer people around, there was more room for the surviving members of society to experiment, innovate, and push forward into the Renaissance. The plague had not only caused suffering and death, it had also created an opportunity for change. With fewer workers, the survivors had more power, and that meant more opportunities for those willing to take risks and explore new ways of doing things. So, as much as the Black Death reshaped society, it also set the stage for the incredible transformation that was to come. But you, the survivor, would have no way of knowing that right now. For you, it's about getting through the day, trying to rebuild what's been lost, and wondering whether things will ever go back to normal or if this is the new normal. The real question, though, is how long it will take for people to get back on their feet. Some historians argue that the Black Death hastened the decline of feudalism, while others say it simply restructured the way society worked. Either way, it's clear that the world you're living in now is very different from the one you knew before the plague. It's a world that's weaker, more fragile, and still grappling with the scars left by the disease. But it's also a world where new opportunities are opening up for those who are able to seize them. In the end, the Black Death wasn't just a tragic event, it was a catalyst for change. As you stand in the ruins of the world you once knew, you might not realize it, but you're living through one of the most significant turning points in history. You've survived something no one thought you could, and now you're in the midst of the rebuilding. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's the beginning of something new. So, here we are, you're still standing, and the world around you has taken a darker, quieter turn. The survivors, like yourself, have now been thrown into the very peculiar position of witnessing history as it unfolds before your eyes. Life after the Black Death is anything but straightforward. It's a patchwork quilt of survival, grief, and, weirdly enough, rebirth. As cities recover, the question on everyone's mind is, how do you rebuild after a catastrophe of this scale? It's not just about filling the empty homes or planting crops in deserted fields, no, it's much deeper than that. The survivors face something far more complicated. How do you move on after losing so much? How do you go from a world where death was a constant companion to a world that has to learn how to live again? The immediate aftermath of the plague isn't exactly filled with hope and optimism. You're left dealing with the haunting silence of deserted streets, homes that now stand empty, and the disintegration of families, businesses, and entire communities. It's like a ghost town, but the ghosts aren't the ones you want to interact with. The survivors are forced to navigate this eerie landscape, knowing that the people they once knew and loved are now gone. There's a strange kind of pressure hanging in the air. For the nobility, there's the daunting task of holding on to what little they have left, trying to maintain some semblance of power while grappling with the reality that many of their estates are in ruins. For peasants, though, the plague offered an opportunity. The labor shortage meant that the surviving workers could demand more money and better conditions. That's the silver lining here, at least for the lower classes, a shift in the balance of power. The peasants who had been at the bottom of the social ladder now had the upper hand. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that you can ask for a better life and actually get it. It's like a dream come true, but with a bitter twist, knowing the price for it was so high. However, these changes didn't happen overnight. The nobility fought back with legal measures to prevent the lower classes from making too many demands. They passed laws that set maximum wages and limited workers' rights, trying to regain control of the situation. But the reality was that the power had shifted permanently. Feudalism was crumbling, and there was nothing that the aristocracy could do to stop it. The peasants had tasted power, and they weren't willing to go back to their old, submissive lives. As for the church, it was in a bit of a crisis too. Once the trusted guide for all matters spiritual, it found itself unable to answer the big questions in the face of such a catastrophe. Many of the clergy had died, and with their deaths, the credibility of the church began to take a serious hit. People began to question the very institution that had long promised them salvation and comfort. Was the church failing them? Could God really be punishing them for their sins when so many innocent lives were taken by this terrible disease? To cope with a spiritual void, many people turned to more extreme religious movements. One of the most notable was the flagellant movement, where people would publicly whip themselves in acts of penitence, hoping to win God's favor. They believed that by showing their suffering, they could somehow end the plague. This, of course, didn't help at all, but it served as an outlet for the anguish people felt. It was like a desperate cry for help in a world that had no answers. But not everyone turned to religion to fill the void. Some, in fact, began to embrace more rational ways of thinking. With the decimation of the church's power, some intellectuals began to question traditional beliefs. This was the beginning of a new era of thought, the Renaissance. The plague, as strange as it sounds, played a role in setting the stage for new ideas to flourish. Fewer people meant more resources for those who were still around, and suddenly, scholars had the opportunity to ask new questions, explore new ideas, and push for advancements in science, philosophy, and art. There's an irony to all this. The Black Death, this terrible event that wiped out so many, also paved the way for the birth of modern Europe. The Renaissance didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was the product of a world that had been shattered and left to rebuild. The survivors of the Black Death were the ones who would go on to change the course of history. But, for now, they were still picking up the pieces. You might be wondering how the survivors of the plague coped with the psychological toll of it all. The answer? Not well. Many people who made it through the plague carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. The constant fear of death, the loss of so many loved ones, and the knowledge that they had survived when so many hadn't, it was enough to leave anyone with scars. In fact, even today, historians argue over the long-term effects of the plague on the mental health of Europe's population. Some suggest that the trauma led to a more pessimistic worldview, while others argue that it sparked a kind of existential crisis that fueled the desire for change. But despite it all, people did survive, and from that survival came innovation, resilience, and eventually the blossoming of new ideas. The survivors rebuilt, bit by bit, in a world that had once seemed to have no future. They rebuilt their cities, their economies, and their lives. They adapted to a new world, one that was forever marked by the plague, but also one that had the potential to rise from the ashes. The Black Death left an indelible mark on Europe, no doubt. But for you, the survivor, it's your chance to witness a new beginning, a world that, though broken, can still be mended. And in that, perhaps, lies the greatest lesson of all. Even after the darkest times, the world can begin to heal. As you walk through the streets now, with the rubble of the past still scattered around, you can feel the undercurrent of change. It's subtle, but it's there. The air, once thick with fear, is starting to shift. You see it in the faces of the people who survived. Their expressions are weary, but there's a flicker of something else now. Maybe it's hope, or maybe it's just the understanding that life, despite the unimaginable horror, goes on. They are learning to live again, but they will never forget the ghosts of those lost. But there's another group that's quietly gaining ground during this period of recovery. The merchants. The trade routes, though scarred by the plague, are beginning to open up once more. Ships are setting sail again, and goods are flowing between cities, though not at the same pace as before. But now, something has shifted in the way people view wealth and power. Before the plague, it was all about land ownership, nobility, and the inherited wealth of the aristocracy. Now, it's about commerce. The merchants who survived the worst of the plague have learned how to navigate the disrupted economy. They're rebuilding their networks, and in doing so, they're slowly pulling Europe out of its economic stagnation. Imagine being one of these merchants. You've lived through the plague, but now you're in the driver's seat. The traditional structures of society have cracked open, and in the rubble, you see an opportunity. You know the ins and outs of trade better than anyone. You can read the winds of the market, and you have the capital to invest in goods. You're in a prime position to thrive, and suddenly, you're no longer just a businessman. You're part of a new class. You're no longer just surviving. You're starting to thrive in a world that is finally rebuilding itself. However, it's not just trade and economics that are starting to change. The Black Death has led to something that no one expected, a shift in how people think about their place in the world. A shift in worldview. In a time of catastrophe, when everyone's belief in the old structures has been shaken, people are beginning to turn inward. They're questioning their purpose, their beliefs, and the meaning of life. Some are turning back to religion, but many are beginning to question the authority of the church. They're looking for something else, something that resonates with their own experience, something that connects them to the future. This shift in thinking is going to fuel the intellectual revolution that will eventually become the Renaissance. It's in this period of uncertainty that people begin to rediscover the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. They turn to the philosophers and scientists of the past, seeking answers to the questions they can't get from their church or their monarch. The Black Death, in all its horror, has created a vacuum of old beliefs, and in that vacuum, new ideas begin to grow. As a survivor, you're part of this process. You've lived through the plague, and you've seen firsthand how fragile life can be. Perhaps that gives you a new perspective. Maybe now, more than ever, you're beginning to see the world not as something fixed, but as something malleable, something that can be changed, rebuilt, and reimagined. But not everyone is on board with this shift in thinking. The church is fighting tooth and nail to hold on to its power, but it's losing its grip. More and more people are questioning the divine right of kings, the supremacy of the church, and the rigid social structures that have ruled for centuries. It's not just an intellectual revolution, it's a social one as well. The survivors of the Black Death are slowly realizing that they're not beholden to the old ways of thinking. They are, in a sense, free to create a new world. Of course, it's not all rosy. The survivors still face many challenges. Economic recovery is slow. People are still grieving their losses, and the fear of disease lingers in the air. But there's a sense of resilience too. People are rebuilding their lives, reconnecting with their communities, and finding new ways of looking at the world. But there's also a growing sense that what happened during the Black Death could happen again. No one knows when, but the fear of another plague is still very real. People don't trust the old ways, but they don't have any concrete answers either. They've seen what can happen when society crumbles under the weight of an unseen enemy. The memories of the Black Death are still fresh, and that fear will continue to shape society for years to come. However, you, the survivor, understand something that many others don't yet. The Black Death didn't just break things down, it made space for new things to grow. It made space for new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new ways of living. You've lived through something no one thought possible, and now you're living in a world that's slowly, hesitantly, learning how to stand up again. You may not see it yet, but in your lifetime, the world will change in ways that no one could have predicted. The collapse of old systems, the rise of new ideas, the reimagining of what it means to be human, these things are all happening right now, and you're a part of that transformation. Maybe you'll never fully understand the scope of it, but what's certain is that the Black Death, terrible and tragic as it was, didn't mark the end. It was just the beginning of something new. As the years pass and the world around you slowly begins to rebuild, there's a strange feeling in the air. It's hard to put into words, but it's as though everyone is collectively holding their breath, unsure of what will happen next. The Black Death, though gone, still lingers in the minds of the survivors. Its shadow hangs over every decision, every action, and every new idea. But despite this, there's an undeniable sense of optimism, of quiet renewal. Things are changing. The future doesn't seem as bleak anymore, though it's still fragile. In the wake of the plague, people began to rebuild their communities, but this time, something was different. Society wasn't going to go back to the way it was. No one could forget the horror they had just lived through, and that meant that everything had to be reconsidered. For you, the survivor, this is not just about rebuilding structures and economies. It's about rebuilding the very idea of what life means after the plague. People are questioning old traditions, and in doing so, they're making room for new ways of living. Think about how life was before the plague. Rigid, predictable. You worked the land or followed the rules of your station. You were bound by tradition and expectation. But now, after everything, those old bonds have loosened. You, along with the other survivors, are part of a generation that is starting to break free from the past. You've survived something unimaginable, and that survival has given you a new perspective on life. You're no longer content to live according to old norms. You're beginning to think bigger about who you are, where you belong, and what the future holds. And it's not just the peasants who are feeling this shift. The aristocracy, too, is being forced to adapt. With the sudden loss of so many of their peers, they no longer have the same control over the land and the people who work it. The old power structures are faltering. Suddenly, a merchant or a craftsman is just as valuable as a lord. The landscape of power is changing. There's a growing sense that the status quo is no longer valid, and new ideas about wealth, power, and status are beginning to emerge. In short, things are being redefined, and the old rules are no longer as important as they once were. What's even more fascinating is that this shift isn't limited to the peasantry or the upper class. It extends to the intellectual world, too. The Renaissance, which is slowly but surely taking root, is beginning to blossom in the aftermath of the Black Death. There's a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman thought, of classical knowledge that had been forgotten or suppressed for centuries. This intellectual revolution is powered by a collective desire to understand more about the world and humanity's place within it. But there's a challenge too. As new ideas spread, they're not always welcomed by the authorities. The church, already weakened by the plague and the loss of so many clergy, is fighting to maintain its grip on power. The intellectuals, artists, and thinkers of the time are pushing boundaries, questioning long-held beliefs, and challenging the traditional power structures that have governed life for so long. You, as a survivor, might feel caught in the middle. You're part of a generation that has lived through catastrophe and seen the old world crumble. You've survived, and now you're living in a time when everything is up for grabs. There's a sense of excitement in the air, but also an undercurrent of fear. Change is coming, and not everyone is ready for it. As much as the intellectuals and artists are pushing for change, there's also the practical side of life that must be dealt with. The economy, though showing signs of recovery, is still fragile. Trade has picked up again, but it's not yet what it once was. Cities that were once thriving metropolises are now shells of their former selves. People are still afraid of the plague's return, so even though things are getting back to normal in many ways, there's still an edge of caution that hangs in the air. It's a bit like learning to walk again after a long injury. You want to move forward, but you're still hesitant, still worried that something will trip you up. One thing that has changed, though, is the way people live. The survivors of the Black Death are becoming more aware of their own mortality. The concept of life being fragile and fleeting is now ingrained in their psyche. It's not that people are suddenly obsessed with death, but rather that they have a deeper understanding of its inevitability. They're beginning to appreciate life in ways they never did before. There's a kind of quiet urgency to their daily lives, now a desire to make the most of the time they have. Some will use this new outlook to innovate and create, while others will turn to religion for answers. But all are affected by the plague in some way, and all are beginning to understand that the world they once knew is gone forever. So, as you walk through the streets of your town or city, you might not see it right away, but you're living through a time of profound transformation. You're witnessing the rebuilding of not just structures and cities, but the very fabric of society itself. And while there's fear and uncertainty in the air, there's also hope. Hope that a new world, one forged by the fire of tragedy and the resilience of humanity, is beginning to emerge. It's a world that is learning to live in the face of death, to rebuild after destruction, and to look forward to a future that once seemed impossible. And you, the survivor, are at the center of it all. The Black Death may have ravaged your world, but it's also given you a chance to be part of something new, something better, something that has been reshaped by the lessons of the past and the courage of those who lived through it. The years following the Black Death are a blur of survival and renewal. If you've made it this far, you've already witnessed the collapse of old systems, the frailty of life, and the strange new world emerging from the ruins. But the question remains, how do you keep going when the world around you seems so fragile? The simple truth is that, in the wake of such devastation, the survivors had no choice but to adapt, evolve, and carry on. Now, life isn't necessarily easier. You're still faced with uncertainty, and every shadow of death feels like it could resurface. The fear of another plague has never really left. People whisper about it in the streets. You can almost hear the panic bubbling beneath the surface, but it's different now. There's an awareness that wasn't there before, a sharper understanding of how easily life can be taken away. It's not the carefree existence of the past. It's a reality that's been reshaped by trauma, and while that may feel overwhelming, it also means that society is slowly learning to be more cautious, more self-aware. It's in this atmosphere of both fear and hope that new ideas are beginning to take root. The intellectual and cultural shifts sparked by the survivors of the plague are beginning to show their true impact. People are thinking differently now. They're beginning to look at the world through new lenses, challenging established norms and reimagining what it means to live. The Renaissance, that glorious rebirth of art, science, and thought, is taking its first steps, powered by a generation that has learned to rebuild from the ground up. But the rebirth isn't limited to intellectual and artistic pursuits. The economic landscape is slowly finding its balance too. The economy, though still fragile, is beginning to recover. The merchant class is expanding, new towns are emerging, and old ones are being revitalized. The population is not what it once was, but there's a strange sense of optimism in the air. People are learning to thrive in a world that has lost so much, and that resilience is what will ultimately drive Europe forward. For you, a survivor, the post-plague world presents both opportunities and challenges. You've lived through the worst. Now, you can see the world through different eyes, with a fresh understanding of the impermanence of life. It's almost as if you're living in a world where everything is possible because, at any moment, it could all disappear again. But that awareness, the knowledge of how quickly things can change, isn't just a burden, it's a source of strength. You've survived, and that survival gives you the power to shape your future. But what does that future look like? For some, it's about finding security in a world that's anything but stable. For others, it's about creating something newer, new way of living, thinking, and being. The survivors are not just rebuilding the old world, they're constructing a new one from the lessons learned in the rubble. The plague was a wake-up call, a harsh reminder of the fleeting nature of life, and as much as it destroyed, it also gave birth to the possibility of a world that was more connected, more aware, and, perhaps, more resilient than before. As you walk through the now bustling town or village, you might see signs of this rebirth. The streets are filled with people once again, but now there's a new sense of purpose. The market is lively, with new trades and goods being exchanged. New buildings are rising from the ashes of the old ones, and there's a sense that the world is slowly but surely healing. It's not perfect, and it may never be the same as it was before the plague, but it's alive. And for all its scars and flaws, it's a world that has been remade by those who endured the hardest of trials. You might notice something else too: the way people treat one another. The old class distinctions are still there, of course, but there's a new awareness that everyone has a role to play. The survivors of the plague, no matter their station, have all experienced the same horror, and that shared trauma has created a bond that didn't exist before. There's a sense of solidarity, even among the rich and the poor, the noble and the peasant. It's not perfect, but there's a recognition that, in this new world, survival isn't just about individual strength, it's about working together. And then there's the arts. The rebirth of culture and creativity that was once stifled by rigid structures is now beginning to flourish. Artists are experimenting with new ideas. Architects are designing buildings that are more open, more airy, and more focused on light than ever before. Writers, musicians, and philosophers are pushing boundaries, eager to embrace the freedom that has emerged in the aftermath of the plague. It's a time of intellectual and cultural explosion, of renewal in every sense of the word. But despite all this progress, there's still a sense that the world could tip back into chaos at any moment. The fear of another plague remains in the hearts of the people, and the lessons learned from the past are fresh in everyone's mind. The survivors know that they've lived through the worst, and while they may be rebuilding, they are also living with the knowledge that nothing is guaranteed. This balance of hope and fear, of rebuilding and uncertainty, defines the world after the Black Death. It's a world that has been scarred, but not broken. It's a world that has learned from its past mistakes, but still faces the unknown. It's a world that is beginning to rise from the ashes, stronger and more resilient than before. As you look around at the world you've helped rebuild, it's hard not to feel a sense of pride. You've survived when so many others didn't. You're part of the generation that rebuilt the world, that looked death in the face and said, "Not today." And in that act of survival, of continuing despite the odds, you've shaped the future. Now that the world around you is starting to stabilize, you can feel the change in the air. It's almost like a hum, a quiet undercurrent of something new. The years following the Black Death haven't been easy. In fact, they've been filled with more uncertainty and struggle than you could have ever imagined. But something else has happened as well. The resilience of the survivors, of you and everyone around you, has brought forth a new way of thinking. It's subtle, but it's there in optimism creeping in, where there was once only despair. People are beginning to embrace new ideas, especially when it comes to how they view their own role in society. There's a shift away from blind obedience and tradition towards a more individualistic perspective. It's not that people are throwing away everything they've known, but they're beginning to question old beliefs. For so long, life was governed by the rigid structures of feudalism and the authority of the church. But now, in the aftermath of the plague, things are loosening. There's room to explore, to think, and, for the first time in a long time, to act in ways that were once unthinkable. Take, for example, the rise of the merchant class. The survivors of the Black Death have realized that wealth can be earned through trade, not just inherited through land. People who once lived on the fringes of society, those who worked in shops, sold goods, or engaged in local trade are now finding themselves in positions of power. They've begun to shape the economy, and in doing so, they've created a new sense of mobility. The idea that your place in life is predetermined by birth is starting to fall apart. If you've got the skill, the drive, and the luck, you can make it. But this is only one aspect of the social change that's unfolding. The intellectual landscape is shifting as well. As Europe begins to emerge from the shadow of the plague, there's an explosion of new ideas. The Renaissance, though still in its early stages, is gaining momentum. Scholars are rediscovering the classical texts of the Greeks and Romans, and in doing so, they're questioning everything they've been told for centuries. The study of science, philosophy, and art is blossoming. There's a collective desire to break free from the past and embrace a future where knowledge and reason take precedence. This intellectual awakening isn't just for the elite, either. People of all walks of life are beginning to value education and the pursuit of knowledge. The plague, in its horrific wake, has opened the eyes of many to the fragility of life, and they're determined not to let it slip away without learning all they can. Libraries, though small by modern standards, are starting to open in cities, and the sharing of ideas is becoming more common. It's a time of intellectual freedom and exploration, and you, as a survivor, are part of it. But it's not just the intellectuals who are shaping the world. The arts are experiencing a renaissance of their own. Artists, musicians, and writers are exploring new ways to express the human condition, ways that reflect the trials and triumphs of those who lived through the plague. It's a time of great creativity, and the works produced during this period will go on to influence the future of Western civilization. Painters like Jan van Eyck and architects like Filippo Brunelleschi are beginning to challenge the artistic conventions of the past, creating works that will stand the test of time. Music, too, is evolving, and writers are beginning to focus on more human, personal themes instead of solely religious subjects. But there's something else, something you might not have noticed before. There's a growing sense of community. People who once lived in isolation, either in rural villages or distant towns, are starting to come together. The cities, though still recovering from the plague's devastation, are beginning to pulse with life again. You see it in the way people interact with one another, in the way they rebuild their relationships. They're no longer just surviving, they're living again. The plague has forced everyone to reconsider what matters most, and for many, that means re-establishing connections with others. The reconstruction of social bonds, however, isn't always a smooth process. Many people are still grieving their losses, and some of the psychological scars from the plague will never heal. There's a dark undercurrent that still lingers in the streets. People walk around with the knowledge that death could return at any time. It's not that the survivors are obsessed with death, but it's always there in the background, a reminder of how fragile life really is. People have a heightened appreciation for their fleeting existence, and that means they've started to live with more urgency, more passion. You might even find that the survivors around you are more focused on the present than the future, perhaps, because they know how quickly everything can change. This heightened awareness is shifting the way people think about the future. In a way, the plague's aftermath has opened a new chapter in the human story. It's no longer just about survival, it's about living with purpose. The survivors, like you, have learned that nothing is guaranteed, and that understanding has sparked a new vigor in everything from commerce to art, from family life to intellectual pursuits. As the world rebuilds, new structures are taking shape. The feudal system is beginning to crumble, and in its place, a more fluid society is emerging, one where mobility, wealth, and education are becoming the key to success. The old ways are dying, and while this might feel uncertain, it also offers an incredible opportunity to reinvent the world. This is the world you're living in, Noah, born from the fire of devastation and the resilience of those who survived. It's a world that's still fragile, still evolving, but also full of promise. You are part of something greater than yourself, part of a generation that has lived through the unimaginable and emerged stronger on the other side. The world you now live in is not the same one you knew before the Black Death. It's a world that's been reshaped by tragedy, but also by hope, creativity, and the drive to build something better. You've witnessed the end of one era, but you're now living in the dawn of another. What comes next is still to be written, and you, as a survivor, are helping to write that story. By now, the echoes of the Black Death have started to fade into the background of everyday life. The markets are bustling once again, with goods from distant lands flowing into Europe. Trade routes that had once been halted in their tracks are now alive with activity. You can hear the chatter of merchants haggling, the clatter of coins exchanging hands, and the steady hum of a world slowly but surely coming back to life. It's almost as though the plague was a bad dream, a nightmare that has finally ended. And yet there's an odd, lingering sense that it's all still fragile, that this world of rebirth and renewal could be shattered again just as easily as it was before. But you know better than most. You've lived through the worst. The world has changed, and so have you. You've seen things that no one should ever have to see, and you've felt the weight of loss that could break even the strongest. But here you are, still standing. And in that, you've learned something valuable, something the rest of society is just beginning to understand. Life is fragile, and the only thing certain in this world is change. You don't know what tomorrow will bring, but you've learned to embrace each day, each moment, and to rebuild a life that, at one point, seemed impossible. But how does one rebuild after something like the Black Death? How do you go on living when everything around you has been swept away? The answer is simple, and yet it's one that takes time to fully grasp. The key is adaptability. It's the ability to bend, to change, and to flow with the currents of life, no matter how turbulent they may seem. You can't control everything that happens, but you can control how you respond to it. That's what the survivors of the plague learned, and it's why, despite the odds, they are thriving in a world that is, at best, uncertain. Take a look at the way people are living now. The great divide between the aristocracy and the peasantry is beginning to fade. Oh, sure, the old systems still exist, but they're not as rigid as they once were. The labor shortage caused by the Black Death has given the common people a bargaining chip that they've never had before. Now, peasants have the power to demand better wages and better working conditions. There's a new social mobility at play, and for the first time in centuries, it's no longer about birthright, it's about what you can do and how you can contribute to society. The surviving merchants, too, are riding the wave of opportunity. They're no longer just the middlemen of society, they're the engines that are driving economic growth. The cities are starting to grow again, and with them, the merchant class is rising. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about prosperity, about building a future that can endure, that can be better than the one that existed before the plague. And though there are still threats on the horizon, the survivors are determined to forge ahead. But the changes aren't just economic or social. There's a shift in how people view the world itself. Before the plague, life was a matter of enduring the harsh realities of existence. But now, there's a new drive, a desire to make life better, to improve it, to enjoy it. People are beginning to focus on things like beauty, art, and knowledge. The Renaissance, though still in its early stages, is slowly unfolding. Artists are beginning to experiment with new styles, painters are exploring more humanistic themes, and architects are designing buildings that reflect the beauty of the world they live in. And you, the survivor, are living in the midst of it all. It's not just about surviving anymore, it's about thriving. It's about contributing to a new world, a world that's being built on the lessons learned from the past and the resilience of those who lived through it. It's a world where new ideas are being embraced, where creativity is flourishing, and where the old ways of thinking are being replaced by something better. But let's not forget, the Black Death was not the only crisis that people faced. There were other challenges: famine, war, and political unrest that continued to shape the world even after the plague had passed. It's easy to think that life was just going to go back to normal after such a catastrophic event, but the truth is, life was never normal again. It became something new. And that newness, that potential for reinvention, is what makes this period so fascinating. For you, the survivor, it's about finding your place in this transformed world. You've seen what happens when the old ways fail, and you've felt the pain of loss. But you've also witnessed the incredible resilience of humanity, and now you're part of a world that is rebuilding from the ground up. You might not be in control of everything, but you are a part of something much bigger. You are part of a world that is learning from the past, moving forward with hope, and determined to make a better future. In many ways, the Black Death was a wake-up call. It reminded humanity just how fragile life can be. But it also revealed something far more important: the power of survival. The ability to adapt, to rebuild, and to learn from the worst that life can throw at you is what has allowed humanity to endure through the ages. The Black Death was only one chapter in the long, tumultuous history of the world, and though it left its mark, it didn't define the future. Instead, it opened the door to new possibility, a future built on the strength and resilience of those who survived. As the world continues to rebuild, there's something uniquely strange about how people view the future now. It's not so much about blind optimism as it is about cautious hope. Everyone has learned the hard way that nothing is guaranteed, but even amidst the uncertainty, there's a growing sense of excitement, almost like the dawn of a new age. Things are happening in small yet profound ways, and the world is changing, even if the scars of the Black Death are still very much there. Life, for you, is starting to take on a new shape. You've seen the darkest side of humanity's fragility, and yet you are standing here today, among the survivors. You might not know exactly what tomorrow will bring, but you've come to understand that you have the power to make it count. The world you now live in is not the world of the past. It's a new world, and it's being shaped by the people who lived through the worst and came out the other side. Looking around, you see signs of that new world everywhere. In the cities, the streets are bustling with energy, the market is filled with goods and new faces, and life seems to be returning to its vibrant rhythm. Yet, there's something different now, a new pace, a new awareness. You can feel it in the air. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving, finding joy in the smallest things, and creating something meaningful out of what remains. People are beginning to understand that life is fleeting, so they're learning to make the most of every moment. The Renaissance, though still in its early stages, is beginning to take root. Artists and thinkers are exploring new ways of expressing themselves, and intellectuals are questioning everything they've been taught. It's a time of creativity and discovery, and for the first time in centuries, people are not just surviving, they're dreaming again. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, though yet to be fully recognized, are paving the way for a new era of expression, blending science and art in ways that will change the world forever. In a strange way, the Black Death had a hand in this. By wiping out a third of the population, it created a world where new ideas could take root. The old guard was weakened, and in the void left by the catastrophe, new voices found space to speak. Society was forced to rethink its priorities, its structure, and its values. The Church's grip on Europe had loosened, and people were more willing to question their old beliefs. And it wasn't just intellectuals who were making waves. Ordinary people, survivors like you, were beginning to demand more from their world. The feudal system, which had dominated society for centuries, was slowly but surely losing its hold. People were beginning to recognize that they had the power to shape their own destinies, no longer tied to birthright or tradition. For the survivors, this newfound sense of agency is both a gift and a challenge. You've witnessed the fragility of life, the way everything can change in an instant, and that's left you with a certain urgency. It's not just about rebuilding, it's about building something better, something that will last. This new world, though still fragile, offers a chance to create a future that's more open, more adaptable, and more resilient. But it's not all smooth sailing. As with any time of transition, there are struggles, especially as old systems continue to fight for relevance. The nobility, still reeling from the loss of so many of their peers, is reluctant to relinquish their power. They're doing everything they can to hold on to their land, their wealth, and their influence. The merchant class is growing in strength, and with it, a new form of power is emerging. Though the aristocracy may resist this change, the reality is that the world is shifting beneath their feet. For you, a survivor, it's not just about watching history unfold, it's about being a part of it. You've lived through the devastation, and now you're standing at the threshold of something new. You have the chance to be part of a world that's being reborn. The Black Death may have left its scars, but it also created space for new ideas, new ways of living, and new opportunities for those brave enough to take them. You're no longer just surviving, you're living with a sense of purpose, a desire to make the most of the time you have. And in this new world, the idea of community has taken on a different meaning. The survivors have banded together in ways they never would have before. There's a sense of solidarity, of knowing that no one can get through life alone. In the face of unimaginable loss, people have found a way to lean on each other, to share in the burdens of life and death. It's not perfect, but it's a start. People are looking to the future with cautious optimism, knowing that the future is uncertain, but also believing that they have the strength to face whatever comes next. As you look around, you realize that the world is not just recovering from the Black Death, it's evolving. It's a world that has been changed, shaped by the survivors, by the lessons learned in the face of tragedy. And for the first time in a long time, there's a sense of hope. Hope that the mistakes of the past won't be repeated, that the world, though scarred, can be rebuilt into something stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate. You're part of that rebuilding, part of that evolution. And while the road ahead is still uncertain, there's one thing you can be sure of. The survivors, like you, are the ones who will shape the future. The Black Death may have shattered the world you knew, but it also gave birth to a new one, a world where resilience, creativity, and hope will carry you through. As time moves forward, the world is beginning to feel less like a landscape of devastation and more like a place where people can start to breathe again. The survivors, those who made it through the ravages of the Black Death, are slowly but surely beginning to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives, their beliefs, and their future. There's still fear lingering, quiet, ever present, but it no longer holds the same power. You, as one of the survivors, have learned that life goes on, even after the most unimaginable tragedy. And with that realization comes a profound shift in how you approach the world. Gone are the days of merely existing. No longer is it about surviving each day, wondering if the plague will return. It's about living, truly living, in the wake of loss. The survivors now understand something profound. Life is both fragile and precious, fleeting and infinite, all at once. Every day is an opportunity to create something new, something lasting, and the world around you is full of potential. While the scars of the Black Death will never fully fade, they have become part of the foundation upon which a new world is being built. But this new world isn't just one of hope and renewal, it's also one of profound change. The Black Death did not only take lives, it took the old structures of society, and from that void, new ideas are emerging. Social hierarchies that were once firmly entrenched are starting to crack. The wealthy and the noble are no longer the untouchable upper crust of society. The peasantry too is shifting, finding their voices, finding their power, and demanding better wages, better treatment, and better opportunities. The old systems, though still present, are no longer as rigid or as unassailable as they once were. And you, a survivor, are witnessing all of this firsthand. You've seen what it's like to live in a world that's turned upside down, to rebuild from the ground up after everything you once knew has been lost. It's not an easy road, and it never will be. There are still hard days, days when you question whether it's all worth it, days when the grief of what was lost comes rushing back. But there's something else now, something that wasn't there before: the desire to build something better, something more enduring. The emergence of the Renaissance, the explosion of artistic and intellectual activity, is a reflection of this change. People are looking beyond survival and starting to think about what comes next. What kind of world do we want to live in? What do we want to leave behind for the generations that will follow? These questions are becoming central to the way people think about their future. You too are part of this new generation, one that has learned to value life, to appreciate beauty, and to embrace creativity. You might find yourself walking through the streets of your town, listening to the sounds of new ideas being exchanged, watching as people work together to rebuild what was lost. The arts are flourishing. Painters, musicians, poets, and philosophers are coming together, exploring new forms of expression, pushing the boundaries of what is possible. Artists like Giotto and Dante are already beginning to shape the way the future will understand art and literature, blending human emotion with divine inspiration in ways that will inspire centuries to come. But it's not just the artists who are making their mark. Intellectuals are beginning to question old truths and rediscover ancient wisdom. Thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus are reaching back into the classical past to bring forward ideas about humanism, reason, and the importance of individual thought. The Black Death may have shattered the old world, but from its ashes, these new ideas are emerging ideas that will shape the modern world in ways that people like you can only begin to imagine. There's another shift happening, Tuan, that's less obvious but no less important. People are starting to understand the value of community in a new way. The shared experience of surviving such a devastating event has created bonds that weren't there before. People who were once divided by class, by wealth, by geography are beginning to come together. There's a new sense of solidarity among the survivors. They know that if they're going to rebuild, they must do it together. For you, as a survivor, this is a time of reflection. You've lived through so much, and while the scars of the past will always be with you, you also know that the future holds new possibilities. The world you now live in is one that's slowly rebuilding itself, one piece at a time. It's a world full of hope, creativity, and collaboration. And while there's still fear, still uncertainty, there's also something more important: a belief in the power of people to shape their destiny, to create the kind of world they want to live in. The Black Death didn't just break the world, it gave birth to something new. The survivors, like you, are living in the aftermath of this birth. You are part of the generation that will shape the future, that will take the lessons learned from tragedy and use them to build a new world. And in that, there's a kind of beauty, a kind of grace that the survivors of the Black Death are beginning to understand. You might not know where the road ahead will take you, but one thing is certain: you have survived. And in that survival, you found a strength that will carry you through the challenges to come. The future is yours to shape, and the world is waiting for the mark you will leave on it. It's been years since the Black Death swept through the world, and though the scars have faded somewhat, the lessons it taught still linger in the air. Life has moved on, but it feels different now. The world is still in a state of rebuilding, but it's no longer a world defined by fear. It's a world defined by possibility. For you, a survivor, this is a strange new reality. It's not just about making it through each day anymore. It's about embracing what's ahead, despite the uncertainty that still clouds the future. You look around at the cities, the villages, the towns, and you can see the changes, the quiet undercurrent of transformation. People are walking with more purpose, speaking with more conviction. There's a sense of energy that wasn't there before. It's not just the physical rebuilding, though, that's happening too, but it's the rebuilding of the spirit. There's something different in the way people move through the world now. A deeper understanding, perhaps, of the fragility of life, but also a stronger commitment to making the most of it. People are living with more urgency, but not in fear. There's a sense of empowerment, a realization that, after surviving such devastation, anything is possible. The feudal system, that age-old structure that governs so much of life, is beginning to crack under the pressure. The survivors of the Black Death have learned that the world doesn't have to be ruled by birthright, by station, or by land. It's a world that's beginning to be shaped by skills, by innovation, by creativity. The peasants, once at the mercy of the nobility, now find themselves in a position of power. The labor shortages that followed the plague have led to increased wages, better working conditions, and a newfound sense of dignity. It's not just about survival anymore, it's about thriving, about taking control of your own destiny, and you can feel that shift in the air. But even as new opportunities arise, the old ways don't just disappear. The nobility fights to hold on to what they can. While they can no longer dictate the lives of their subjects with the same power they once had, they still have wealth and influence. They try to restore the old order, to make sure the balance of power shifts in their favor. The resistance isn't easy, but it's clear that the old guard can no longer dictate how the world will work. And that shift is profound. The church, too, is trying to regain its lost authority. The Black Death had dealt a significant blow to its credibility, and many of the faithful had begun to question the church's role in society. But there's a strange tension now, a push and pull between old and new, between tradition and progress. People are still turning to the church for comfort, for answers to the questions that still linger in the wake of the plague. But the world has changed, and the church, though still powerful, no longer holds the same sway it once did. Meanwhile, the intellectual revolution, the Renaissance, is in full swing. The thinkers of this new age are looking to the past for inspiration, rediscovering the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. The old ideas once suppressed by the medieval worldview are coming back to life. Scholars are challenging everything, from the nature of the universe to the role of humanity in it. For you, the survivor, this intellectual rebirth is an exciting time. You're living in the midst of a period of great thought and discovery. The world is starting to embrace the idea that knowledge can be a force for change, a means of understanding the world and improving it. Art is undergoing a transformation, too. The Renaissance artists are breaking free from the constraints of medieval thinking, creating works that are deeply human, focused on the beauty and complexity of the human experience. Painters like Botticelli and artists like Leonardo da Vinci are pushing the boundaries of what is possible in art. The work they create will influence generations to come, inspiring new ways of thinking about life, death, and everything in between. As you walk through the streets of your town or city, you might catch a glimpse of a new painting or hear a piece of music that stirs something deep inside you. The arts are no longer just about religious devotion or royal patronage. They are about the human experience, about reflecting life in all its glory and its tragedy. You might not always feel like you're part of that great intellectual or artistic movement after all. You're just one person in a sea of survivors, but the reality is that you are. You are part of a generation that has lived through something unimaginable, that has survived, and now finds itself in the unique position of shaping what comes next. The world is being rebuilt, and your role, though small, is crucial. Every day you contribute, whether through your work, your relationships, or simply by being a part of this new world, you are helping to define what that future looks like. But as the world moves forward, it's important to remember the lessons the Black Death taught. It showed humanity the fragility of life, the capriciousness of fate. And though people are rebuilding, there's always a sense of caution, a quiet awareness that the world could change again, in ways they might not be able to predict or control. But this time, they're ready. They've learned that it's not just about surviving, it's about building a world that can endure. For you, as a survivor, the question now isn't just how to live, it's how to live well. The Black Death has shaped your perspective on life in ways you might not have fully realized until now. It's made you more aware of the fleeting nature of time, of the value of each moment, and of the importance of community and connection. The world has been given a second chance, and it's up to you and everyone else who made it through to ensure that it's a better one. The future is no longer an uncertain, distant thing. It's here, now, in the present, and in that, there is something beautiful. As the world begins to emerge from the dark shadow of the Black Death, you, the survivor, find yourself in a peculiar position. You've lived through the worst, and while it may have felt like the end of the world at the time, it's clear now that the world hasn't ended, it's simply changed. The earth keeps turning, and the people who once filled it with life are beginning to rebuild. There's a strange kind of pride in that. It's the kind of quiet victory that doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It's simply knowing that you made it. But as much as the world around you is rebuilding, it's also becoming something entirely new. The old structures, feudalism, rigid social hierarchies, and the iron grip of the church are crumbling. The survivors of the plague are starting to realize that they don't have to live the way they always have. The old systems that defined life are being replaced with something more flexible, more fluid, more centered on individual choice. You can feel it in the way people move, in the way they talk, in the way they interact. There's a new sense of agency in the air. People have been given a second chance, and they're not wasting it. There's a new economic order emerging, too. The old reliance on land ownership and agricultural labor is beginning to shift. You've seen it yourself. The labor shortages that followed the plague have given workers more power. They're demanding better wages, better treatment, and better living conditions. It's a fundamental shift, and it's not just affecting the peasants, it's reshaping the economy at every level. The merchants, too, are thriving. They've learned how to navigate a changing world, and their influence is growing. This newfound mobility and economic opportunity have given rise to new forms of wealth and power, and it's changing the dynamics of society. In this new world, knowledge is becoming just as important as land or wealth. The Renaissance is beginning to take root in the aftermath of the Black Death, and you can feel it. Artists, writers, and intellectuals are rediscovering the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in doing so, they're changing the way people think about everything from the universe to human nature to the very purpose of life. The plague might have decimated populations, but it also cleared the way for new ways of thinking. With fewer people around, there's more room for the new ideas that will fuel Europe's intellectual and cultural rebirth. You're witnessing the birth of a new era, and it's exhilarating. But even amidst all the innovation, creativity, and intellectual fervor, there's still that quiet awareness, that cautious optimism mixed with a little bit of fear. The memory of the Black Death is never far from anyone's mind. People know that life can change in an instant. There's always the possibility that something like the plague could return. But there's something different now. People are no longer just surviving, they're living, they're creating, they're dreaming of a future that they have the power to shape. They're building on the ashes of the past, but they're not looking back, they're looking forward. For you, as a survivor, the question now isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about living well. It's about making your mark on this new world that's taking shape. You've seen what happens when the old world crumbles, but now you're part of something that's rebuilding itself. You're contributing to the new era, whether you realize it or not. And that's something to be proud of. The Black Death may have taken a terrible toll, but it also made space for something beautiful. The future that is being built now is not the future of the past. It's a world that values creativity, knowledge, and collaboration. It's a world where survival isn't the end goal. It's the beginning of something better. You're witnessing the shift, and you're part of it. The world may have once been defined by rigid lines and old rules, but now it's being shaped by the survivors, people like you, who have endured the unimaginable and are now standing at the dawn of a new age. As you continue to walk through this changed world, you might not realize it, but you're living through history. You've survived the Black Death, and that makes you a part of something much bigger than yourself. The Renaissance, the intellectual awakening, the economic and social shifts, they're all happening because of people like you. You've seen the world broken, but now you're seeing it heal. And while it's easy to get caught up in the chaos of rebuilding, in the uncertainties of the present, it's important to remember that you are part of the rebuilding process. You are part of the new world that's emerging, a world that's being forged by the lessons learned from the past. The Black Death may have changed everything, but in the end, it didn't break humanity. It reshaped it. The future is still unfolding, but one thing is clear: you, the survivor, are part of its creation. And as the world continues to change, as new opportunities emerge and old systems fall away, you'll find that your place in it is not just about surviving, it's about thriving, about living with purpose, and about embracing the new world you helped build.